Hi, this is Dr. Mercola, and I need to clear up some serious confusion on something you most likely use or seek to avoid using every day. And what is that? Why, of course, it's salt. You've been constantly barraged by the media and health experts who warn you to avoid salt. In fact, there have been studies that suggest a national program to reduce dietary salt could prevent tens of thousands of heart attacks, strokes, and deaths and trim tens of billions of dollars from the healthcare budget. Have you actually fallen for this misinformation and reduced your salt intake? It would be understandable because there have been attempts to get Americans to restrict salt for decades. And in fact, the salt wars began about 40 years ago in 1972 when the National Health, Blood Pressure, and Education Program, which is a coalition of 36 medical organizations and 6 federal agencies, essentially declared that salt was unnecessary and evil. And in 1978, one researcher called salt the most dangerous food additive of all. But the reality is, when you look at an average population and when you increase the salt intake, about 30% of people will experience a small drop in blood pressure when you decrease salt intake, but another 20% will actually have an increase. Now, another point to consider is that what actually happens when manufacturers lower the salt content of food. Usually, they choose to increase artificial flavorings like MSG, which is far worse than salt. So this demonization of salt is of a vital substance like salt could only happen in a society that is ignorant of the history of salt. Now, the use of salt in humans is intimately connected with our progression from a nomadic Stone Age life to one of hunter and gathering. Now, salt, as you know, is needed to make these foods taste good and also to preserve meats and dairy foods for storage and transport. And salt, in fact, historically was considered the gift from the gods. And if you go back into ancient times, Homer referred to salt as a divine substance, and Plato described it as essentially dear to the gods. And in fact, the Celtic word for salt meant holy or sacred. Now, the quest for salt led to seeking to have salt led to development of major trade routes in the ancient world. And if you go back to Roman times, the soldiers were paid partly in salt, so much so that our word salary is derived from the Latin word for salt, which is salarium. So there's this amazing historical history of salt. Now, Western people today consume about half the amount of salt that they consume traditionally. Because before the days of refrigeration, most of our meat and fish was preserved by salting it. And interestingly, the Japanese, who have one of the highest salt intakes in the world, also have, of course, one of the highest life expectancies. Now, interestingly, last year, in spite of all this, last year, the United States Department of Agriculture, the USDA, 2010 dietary guidelines recommended to actually reduce the salt consumption to 3.5 grams a day, which is about half of what it was before, which is shocking considering that we need about 6 grams a day, which is where the 2005 guidelines were. So why do you need salt? Well, let's go over some of the specifics. Salt is essential for life. You simply cannot live without it. However, most people simply don't realize that there's an enormous difference between the standard refined table and cooking salt that most of us are accustomed to using and natural health promoting salts. So what is it good for? It's important for a number of things. First of all, of course, to regulate and maintain our blood pressure, but it's also vital for our nervous system. Chloride is essential for the growth of our brain and development of neurological function. And that the sodium actually activates an enzyme needed for the formation of glial cells. And these are the cells that makes us capable of creative thinking and long-term planning. It's also useful for our metabolism and digestion. The main source of chloride in our body is from salt. And chloride, as you know, is part of hydrochloric acid, which is what we need to digest our food. It's also crucial for our adrenal function. The adrenal glands are responsible for the release and regulation of over 50 of our body's hormones. So when you crave salt, it's actually, in many cases, a sign of poor adrenal function. So hopefully, I've convinced you of the value and the importance of salt, and that you've been actually misinformed about the need to reduce it. Remember, salt is vital and you need it to stay alive. It is not a pernicious toxin or a poison that needs to be avoided at all costs. But you do want to limit, as I mentioned, to avoid the use of typical commercial table and cooking salts. And your grocery store has been, because they've been chemically cleaned. Now, what is a commercial salt? Well, it's purified, and this purification process actually involves this recrystallization of the salt at a very high temperature. And additionally, your table salt is about 97.5% sodium chloride, and 2.5% are other chemicals such as moisture absorbents and iodine. As I said, the salt is heated about 1200 degrees to facilitate the processing, and this heat actually alters the natural chemical structure of the salt. Now, during the drying process, they actually add anti-caking compounds. This is part of the 2.5% that's not sodium chloride, and this ensures that the salt will pour and flow freely. And some of the anti-caking agents that they use are ferrocyanide and aluminosilicate. And these are compounds that give the most concern. And in fact, some European countries where water fluoridation is not practiced actually also add fluoride to table salt. And in France, 35% of the table salt sold contains either sodium or potassium fluoride. And the use of fluoridated salt is widespread in South America. So today's typical common table salt has absolutely nothing in common with the natural salt that your body was designed for and has been used for centuries. So the key here is to always use unrefined salt. And what are your options? Well, by far, the most common one would be sea salt. And it's certainly better than commercial table salt, but it's not ideal. And this is largely a result of the same reasons that we have mercury and toxins that have polluted our fish supply. They've polluted the salt supply too. They've contaminated the oceans because the oceans are being used as a dumping ground for all these toxic poisons like mercury and PCBs and dioxin. So they accumulate and they get transferred to the salt. And in fact, oil spills are pervasive, and they're polluting the seas, and they're becoming more frequent. And in fact, about 90% of all sea salt producers are actually now refining their salt because of this pollution. So today's sea salt simply isn't as healthy as it used to be a few hundred years ago. So personally, I found from my research and review that salt like Himalayan salt is really superior in just about every respect, and it's the one I use. And the Himalayan salt is actually taken from the Himalayas and from deep deposits within those mountains, and it's over 250 million years old. And as far as I can tell, this is by far the purest salt that's available on Earth. It's absolutely uncontaminated with any modern-day industrial toxins or pollutants. And once I learned about this and how beneficial it can be for you, I had my team go out and literally scour the planet and spend over 2 years to find out how they can get it from Nepal, where it's mined, to the United States. And fortunately, they were able to do it. Now, the salt is, Himalayan salt is like this regular commercial table salt is 97.5% sodium chloride and 2.5% garbage that you should not have. Himalayan salt, however, is about 85% sodium chloride, no garbage chemicals in there, and the remaining 15% actually has 84 different trace elements and minerals that your body actually needs. However, it's important to understand that iodine is not added, it's not a natural part of this type of salt. So, and since we have such a large exposure to fluoride and bromide in our environment that impairs our thyroid functions, we're going to want to have a regular source of iodine. But ideally, it should not come from commercial table salts. sources. So this topic is actually we're going to discuss in a different video, but you should have a healthy source of iodine in your diet. It's just not going to be from the salt. So now the Himalayan salt also has a unique structure that stores this energy, and it's actually a crystal. And when it's mined out and you receive it as a crystal, and the crystal contains these minerals and these trace elements that are available actually in a colloidal form, which is a highly absorbable form. So these the array of elements then it forms this really tightly bound crystal, and there's some vibrational components into it with these 84 elements, and it really helps improve your body in so many different ways. And it's a really simple and inexpensive way for your body to get these additional minerals. Now, Himalayan salt also comes in a variety of different forms. That's only table salt that you could pour on your food or put on your food, but you can actually use it as bath salts, and there's even lamps that you can get, and they have other benefits. But it's an amazing component. It is one that I personally use all the time, but there is a warning. I have to warn you about Himalayan salt. It really massively improves the flavor of your food. So if you're using it, I got to warn you before you go using it that there is a strong possibility that you become spoiled and you will just not like any other salt but Himalayan salt. So only consider using that if you're willing to take that risk, because I've become spoiled and I just refuse to have any other salt but the Himalayan salt. So it's an amazing product. Hopefully you'll consider trying it, and certainly if you don't use that, remember the key here is that we need salt. You don't need to go on these low salt diets that are promoted by the government and these health experts, but you want to have a high quality salt to make sure that you get enough sodium chloride, because it's an essential part of what we need, and I would strongly recommend that as a source for you. Now remember, with the Himalayan salt, there's no environmental pollutants, there's no flowing agents involved, and there is no limited shelf life, so you can use it for a long time, and it doesn't require silica packets to prevent the clumping, and it's got these 84 minerals that will really help you